Bonjour, bonjour, messieurs, dames. Bonjour, and welcome to this session on saving peace building from global competition. My name is Stuart Patrick. I'm a senior fellow and director of the program on global order and institutions at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. It's my great pleasure to moderate this distinguished panel. Our task today is to consider what, if anything, the world can do to prevent geopolitical competition from exacerbating and overriding, exacerbating violent conflict and undermining peace processes around the world. We only have 45 minutes for this challenge, but because we have an illustrious panel, that should be plenty of time to solve the world's problems. I want to introduce briefly our distinguished guests. Hassan Salameh is Professor Emeritus of International Relations at Sciences Po, where he was the founding director of the Paris School of International Affairs. He's also a senior advisor, to former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, and more recently, Antonio Guterres' special envoy and special representative for Libya. Henry Wang is founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization, and he is also a former counselor to the China State Council. I got to know, admire Henry when we were both on the steering committee of the Paris Peace Forum several years ago. Hina Rabbani Kar is a former Minister of State for the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. She's also a member of the Global Commission on Governing Risks of Climate Overshoot, which the Paris Peace Forum helped to launch and recently released its excellent final report. And last but not least, Mirko Manzoni is Undersecretary General and Personal Envoy of the UN Secretary General in Mozambique, where he supports the peace process between the government and Renamo. The Paris Peace Forum has recognized his work and those of his colleagues as in one of this year's selected projects, the Maputo Accord, Cultivating a Culture of Peace. Our topic, of course, could not be timelier. After some initial declines in the first post-Cold War decades, a violent conflict has surged, both interstate conflict and also internal conflict. That's most obvious in the case of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and of course in the conflict in Gaza more recently. The number of civil wars has spiked, and many of these supposed internal conflicts, of course, have very important internationalized dimensions, with Syria and Yemen being particular cases in point. The human costs have obviously been enormous. Today, 2 billion people, a quarter of humanity, lives in fragile and conflict-affected states, and that includes more than half of the world's extremely poor. More than 100 million people have been displaced from their homes, either as refugees or IDPs. And at the same time, as a new crisis group report notes, international support for peacemaking and peacekeeping is deteriorating. This upsurge in global violence has multiple causes, as we all know, but surely one of them is the surge in geopolitical competition around the world, which has had great powers become involved either directly or indirectly in those conflicts. It's complicated, and it's at times paralyzed collective security, including with the UN Security Council. This is most obvious in the case of Ukraine, where one of the P5 members is not only an aggressor nation, but it's also used its veto to block enforcement. At the same time, the picture is not entirely black and white. As we'll discuss, the rise of a more multipolar world potentially opens up new possibilities for emerging powers such as China, Brazil, Turkey, India, and others to fill the vacuum and perhaps provide their own good offices and bring them to bear in conflict situations. Finally, in this difficult context, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has proposed his own blueprint, a new agenda for peace, echoing that of Secretary General Boutros-Boutros-Ghali of 3 decades ago. A blueprint, a set of aspirations, and he hopes a practical roadmap for peacemaking. With those preliminaries, what I'd like to do is pose questions to our distinguished panelists, starting, we'll probably do a couple of tours de table, and we'll start with Henry. When you look at the world today, do you see collective security, at least through the United Nations, as an inevitable inevitable casualty of geopolitical rivalry, or do you believe there's still some hope for multilateral efforts to reduce violent conflict? Could you give us a sense what this terrain looks like from the perspective of China?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Steve. Excellent. I mean, you have made a very good, background for our discussion. We have so much distinguished guests, distinguished panel around here, and also a great audience with us. I think the world is really getting into a very dangerous stage now. That there's a lack of trust among the major powers, and also extremely important is that we are, the UN is, which has been guaranteed us for last 78 years a relatively success, preventing the big conflicts and preventing the Third World War, is now starting to malfunction now. It's really not effective anymore. Where I attribute that to the big disagreement, actually the trust that we're missing among those big players. So I still think UN is really the key, to solving those problems. We have to really stick to the UN principle, UN Charter, and UN guidelines. The key is that we have to get all the players, particularly Security Council members, to work together. I mean, that's where the problems are, because you see among the security member countries, there was a rivalry, there's competition, there's an alliance against each other. That's not healthy to solving those regional issues. So I'm really glad to see President Xi and President Biden going to meet in San Francisco this coming week. So I think the international leaders should really get together. We see a lot of successful examples in the past. For example, on the sanctions on North Korea, we're using UN Security Council passing resolutions because of the large consultation taking place. For example, 6-party talks that China has led for so many years. So to build up the consensus among the big players. So I still see the solution for that is that not just one UN Security Council meetings urgently called. We need to actually have regular dialogues between all those big players. Like for the Iran-Russian issues, why can't we have a 7-party talks among the P5 and Russia and Ukraine? Among the Middle East, let's have a Middle East, Arab, Gulf countries, and also P5 member countries sit down and talk. So I think we're lacking these kind of talks. And you're absolutely right. We mentioned about rising powers like China, BRICS countries. We should give them a full, consideration in getting into those dialogues and mediation and play more roles. So I think it's possible. China is the largest peacekeeping force sending country among the P5. So in the situation of Gaza and Palestinian and Israel conflict, why can't we send in the UN peacekeeping force rather than we seeing this, bombardment of each other and huge casualties and civilian losses? So I think UN has to play some active roles. We have to be active. Big countries has to talk. We have to take our act together.
Thank you, Henry. I'm going to come back to you later and ask you about China's own role in mediation, which it's started to ramp up its involvement in that. I'd like to turn to Hassan now, if I might. As Antonio Guterres, his special representative in Libya, you no doubt had a front row seat to what outside powers can do, both positively and negatively, to exacerbate conflict and violence or to help ameliorate it. What are the main lessons that you took from that experience about the intersection of geopolitical competition amongst the great powers and peacemaking on the ground in conflict-affected countries?
Thank you. The first and obvious lesson is something that is not original at all. It's their hypocrisy. To give you just one example, we were ordered to deal only with one government, the one in Tripoli. Then the other government invaded Tripoli at a certain point. And I discovered that 3.5 members, permanent members of the Security Council, out of 5, were supporting the invasion, while we were asked never to deal with the other guy and to deal only with the government in Tripoli. So it's pure hypocrisy. Now there is something else. There is also direct interference. And I know of no civil war, not a single one in the world today, where there is no civil interference and foreign interference. And therefore, it is not an accident that you have foreign interference taking place in Libya or Sudan or Yemen or wherever you want. It's everywhere. The question, who is responsible? I would say that most think tankers and most journalists are lazy because they are obsessed with foreign interference. In fact, it is the domestic dynamics that makes foreign interference happen. It is local players who call for interference, facilitate interference, give legitimacy to interference. Otherwise, it would not necessarily happen. And I think we tend to be lazy and say, hey, why is this country interfering in that country? We don't take into consideration the fact that somebody invited that country to come and interfere. In Libya, the ceasefire has been produced by the efforts of the UN mission I was heading, but also by the fact that one country decided to intervene directly, Turkey, to the support of the government in Tripoli. And this brings us to another story, which is that most of the war that took place in Libya was not among Libyans, but among mercenaries paid for by the Libyans. Because Libya is a rich country, and that can allow itself to pay mercenaries from all over the world. So sometimes a famous battle in Libya was a battle fought by people from Darfur and others from Niger, and very few locals. The mercenaries brought by the Turks were mainly from Syria. In fact, they had been fighting in Syria for a long while. They came and put an end to the encirclement of Tripoli in the spring of 2020. So I think a whole reading of the civil wars need to take place. Civil war is not anymore something that is confined within borders. All civil wars call for interference, and the responsibility for it is less of the interferer on the interferer side and more on the domestic politics. Not so many people now have the patience to read, follow, and understand. That is why the most important decision I think I took in Libya was to compel the UN mission to go back to Libya, live in Libya, and follow from as close as possible what is happening in the domestic politics in Libya, which is the heart of the matter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hassan. I'll come back a little bit later to talk about some of the Secretary General's visions for the future. Shifting to Hina, if I might. Your country has been a leading contributor to UN peace operations, as well as obviously a vocal advocate for a more equitable international order that provides greater voice and weight to countries of the Global South. I'd like to get your assessment of potential reforms to both the composition and decision rules of the UN Security Council. Traditionalists might argue that actually the Security Council is working just fine because it was basically set up, at least in part, to prevent the collective force of the international community from being used against any one of its most powerful members. But frankly, for the rest of us, I think that there's a sense that that this is simply a license for abuse by the great powers, and that they can hide behind their veto, either for themselves or, frankly, for their allies as well. Do you have thoughts about what could be done to make a more equitable and just order that might involve, at the United Nations, and what can be done when the Security Council is blocked? Is there more of a role for the UN General Assembly, which has obviously, in the context of Ukraine, been increasingly asserting itself? Or do you have visions or aspirations for Security Council reform?
Okay, so thank you. And you know, it's very interesting that sitting in the moment that we're sitting in history right now, where we are perhaps making the most mistakes of a proportion that history is certainly going to judge us. We're not going to judge ourselves right now. We're going to let it pass. But history is going to certainly stand judge to the moment. And we still think that we can continue to talk about good intentions, our ability to have a just and fair order. I don't think we intend to have a just and fair order. The intention will have to come before anything else. I think we do not will to have a just and fair order. Let's pause for a moment and look at the moment that we're sitting in. We have had Security Council resolutions calling for, I was looking at the title, calling for the protection of civilians and upholding legal and humanitarian obligations vetoed not once, but already many times since 7th October by countries which are supposed to be the policemen of morality, legality, order, and are supposed to be the ones keeping us away from chaos. So it's really an appalling moment. And I think we need to really absorb it and recognize it. Now, I just want to say that countries who abstained even were 45. Okay, I'm very glad in the second resolution, not in the first one, France wasn't one of the abstainers. But in the first one, even France was, France, UK, US, right? And in the second one, you have still the UK, countries like India, who we are projecting to be the next Security Council members so they can to be the abstinence. And what are we seeking? What is the multilateral system seeking over there through the Security Council resolution? Protection of civilians and upholding legal and humanitarian obligations. So if we cannot, as humanity, come to agree on that, I think we should close the book of how to reform and start questioning our will to do so. At the same time, where Gassam talked about the word hypocrisy, we see that all over the world being used quite excessively because it should be used. We have, we're sitting here talking about multilateralism, whether it will work or not. We've seen the statement of Antonio Guterres, who happens to be the Secretary General of the United Nations. We know that he said that more journalists have died in the last 3 weeks than in any other conflict, any time in the history of the United Nations. We've seen him say that I think more UN workers have died than any other conflict anywhere, and more journalists have died in the last 3 weeks trying to report than any other conflict since 1992, I believe. And we know that 75% of the 10,000 people who've been killed are women and children. So what I'm saying is that since we all stand by and since we allow this moment to pass, I don't think the system, which was already fractured, will be able to hold. Because the difference I want to also mention, and you mentioned whether it should be the General Assembly and whether that should be empowered, and this is very telling, because when the same vote goes to the General Assembly, 120 countries are in favor of that. 120 countries. So this shows how the policemen of the world, through the Security Council, etc., are actually quite undemocratically representing the world's wish to move on a crisis like this. And we do have the solutions, but first of all, before anything else, I think we have to have the will to have the solutions. I think right now the will to have the solution is absolutely not there. The great power competition is less power competition and more competition to continue its hegemonic, in some ways, sense of entitlement and exceptionalism, which has been very, very costly. And as somebody who sits on the other side of the planet, I can tell you that war has come to Europe now, and you can feel the effects of war. War has been in my parts of the world for the last 3 decades, and we have been seeing its impact. So I am right now at the most pessimistic that I have been in the last 46 years of my life, certainly in the last 22 years since I've been in government. And I feel now we're at a moment where we are at precipice, and something will have to give way. Either this will break completely, and there will be more chaos which will not be managed, because words, you cannot use the language of peace to propagate war anymore. You cannot use the language of security to deliver on insecurity. So it's not going to hold. We got away with it. This is far too much, because we are all watching it. We are all witnessing it as we speak. And I think humanity and humans all over the world are reacting. Yeah?
Thank you very much. Very eloquent, very eloquent reminder of the increasing gap between the words in the Charter and actual behavior of member states, not least the most powerful states in the international community. Let me turn now to Mirko. Your office serves as the Secretariat of the Maputo Accord, which supports nationally led and community-focused programs of dialogue and consensus building involving both the government of Mozambique and Renamo. Can you tell us a little bit, partly I want to have some good news here, or could you tell us a little bit about some of the relative successes and perhaps also some failures of that effort, and maybe the role, hopefully productive, that some of the major powers have played in this effort?
Thank you very much first for giving me the opportunity to speak about Mozambique and for Mozambique. I think that every time I went back to New York and visiting the Secretary General, I was sometimes almost embarrassed to tell him that I was bringing good news. Because in this world where we see definitely that conflict, they are expanding and growing, I think that the experience in Mozambique can maybe bring some lessons that they can be applied maybe in other conflicts. Myself personally, I'm not a super talkative person. I'm very discreet, but maybe this is also important inside the process. We tried in Mozambique, first of all, to not apply any agenda. When I listened to Ghassan Salam about interference, what we did in Mozambique, actually, we did all what we could to protect the space for the dialogue between the parties. We gave a lot of, let's say, we gave the full room to them. We tried to serve really the needs of the party, putting aside what we believe was right. Sometimes I experienced very clearly that what I had in mind was wrong. And we tried very much to build a process which then could be considered really a national process. We put, as I said, in front first the agenda of the party. We put aside our ambition, and we try to build solution. We try to help them in building their solution. I have to admit that sometimes I give you an example. It is difficult because when you have also to manage the international community or the diplomats around that they would like also to teach you what is right and wrong, it's not easy. And I give you an example very simple. You know, transitional justice. When we were building up the process and there was the time of deciding what we need to do with the past, how we treat that past. And I remember that, of course, all diplomats, they were explaining to me, you have absolutely to introduce the concept of dealing with the past, of transitional justice, building up a commission, trying to, the classic approach we have. So when you try to introduce this to Mozambicans, they just remain silent and they smile. Because it's not their approach. It's definitely not their approach. So we were listening to them, we tried. They know what is wrong, and they know what went wrong. So we tried to ask to them how they wanted to deal with that past first, what they wanted to do with that past. And instead of, let's say, looking at the past, we tried to look at the future. Instead of working for the with the Ministry of Interior in building a big commission and a big exercise, we tried to work with the youth, trying to introduce a culture of peace, trying to introduce, to make sure that what happened will not happen anymore. These were points. But going back to what can be learned from Mozambique and applied also in conflict that they are ongoing now.
Ce que nous avons appris au Mozambique et qui pourrait s'appliquer au conflit actuel, c'est qu'il faut refuser de laisser déléguer ce processus à d'autres. Il ne faut pas imposer de dialogue face à face entre les parties. Au début, c'était très difficile. Nous avons passé des mois et des mois en processus diplomatique à encourager les conversations et nous nous sommes rendus compte que cela n'était pas suffisant. Et un jour, j'ai dit aux personnes de parler directement et j'ai encouragé ces personnes à se parler directement. J'avais un des interlocuteurs au téléphone et j'ai dit « parlez-lui directement ». Nous avons essayé d'encourager ce dialogue, de nous assurer que les échanges soient possibles. Il y a des processus à l'heure actuelle à travers le monde. Lorsque des parties ne souhaitent pas échanger, elles confient cette tâche à quelqu'un d'autre et en notre qualité d'organisation des Nations Unies, nous devons mettre fin à cette façon de faire parce que voilà quel doit être notre discours. Si vous voulez obtenir la paix, si nous voulons obtenir la paix, vous devez mettre les intéressés au premier plan. On ne peut pas déléguer cela à d'autres personnes. Et je m'arrête là parce que j'ai beaucoup parlé. Je me tourne à nouveau vers Ina. Nous sommes dans un monde très multipolaire et donc il y a la place pour que d'autres pouvoirs soient impliqués dans les processus de paix. Et la Chine a passé beaucoup de temps, investi beaucoup d'énergie à essayer de faciliter ces processus entre l'Iran et l'Arabie saoudite. Est-ce que la Chine a retiré certains enseignements de cette expérience et quelles ont été les motivations et pensez-vous qu'il s'agisse là d'un exemple à suivre pour l'avenir, pour la Chine ou d'autres pays qui veulent s'impliquer dans la médiation de la paix ou qui le font déjà d'ailleurs, qui ont une tradition en la matière? Je pense que c'est une très bonne question en fait, parce qu'au cours des 78 dernières années, mais surtout au cours des 45 dernières années depuis que la Chine s'est ouverte,
for example, China, strike the deal between Saudi and the Iranian, but the fact of the matter is that China is a large trading partner of both countries. And that also, historically, China does not have many baggages with them. China has really had a great relation with them. And also, China has no intervention or invasion of any other country in the last 40 years. You haven't seen anything happen like that. So China probably now become a very credible mediator in terms of sorting out differences. And also, I think those countries, while other major powers failed to mediate, and maybe also have a lot of negative impact itself, as we heard, from this panel. So China stands out as a clean, as a really a neutral, but also very effective guarantor of the peace. So that's why I think that China was able to clinch this deal between Iran and Saudi. But also, for Middle East too. I mean, China is the largest trading partner for all the Gulf countries. China is the largest trading partner for Ukraine and for Russian. And also China has set a peace envoy for both Russian and Middle East crisis. So I think as time goes on, China could play more active role and could really, hosting like, one of the success UN section that had on North Korea, because China has, lead many years of six-party talks. So I think it's important for UN to come out to do the intervention to get really resolutions, but also all those background work and all those pavement work and also all those communication dialogues. You really have to have somebody neutral to able to call both parties to the table. That's extremely important. Now we see all the country take sides, take stands. It's difficult to gather people around the table. I think it's most important, first you have to get people around the table, find a solution, cease fires, and also then we can pass on to the UN to reach consensus and resolution, and even UN peacekeeping forces. So I think it's extremely important for China to play roles like that.
Yeah, it's very interesting to just think about that in a from a U.S. perspective. There were some, perhaps on the more hawkish side of the fence, that were sort of suspicious and wondering about this. But I think actually one thing that was nice to see about the Biden administration was that by and large, I think most of the folks looked at that and said, this is a good thing. There shouldn't be a complaint that China is actually behaving as a mediator and bringing these two countries together. They see this as a positive development, and I think that there's a lot of positive with that experience. I'd like to turn to Hassan now. You helped advise Kofi Annan during the last time there was a major effort in larger freedom era of reform that culminated in the big summit in 2005. Now you've got Secretary General Antonio Guterres has quite a sweeping vision with the new agenda for peace, but also, frankly, the entire summit of the future. Do you feel like there are particular UN reforms that are on the table, or at least have been discussed, that could make the UN, that you would identify as ones that are particularly important for the United Nations to become more effective at doing what it does, with the caveat, of course, that unless the big member states are on board, these things aren't going to go that far?
I don't think the UN needs reform. The UN needs to be resurrected because it's dying. It's dying before our eyes, and we have to recognize it. I was in New York for the General Assembly a month ago. There are 5 countries who have this absolutely extravagant right of veto power. 4 out of the 5 didn't think it was important for them to come to the General Assembly. Putin was not there, President Xi was not there, Sunak was not there, And even Macron was not there. And President Biden came because he lived nearby. So, I mean, it is not reform that we need for the UN, it's resurrection. You want me to give you another example? There was a special session on climate change. And the two major polluters on Earth today, China and the United States, did not have the time to speak at that session. What do you want more? There are 10,000 people dead in Gaza today, and the Security Council is not able to call for a ceasefire. On top of that, not even individually, either one of the three Western countries in the Security Council are calling for a ceasefire. So the Secretary General is calling for a summit for the future for next year, as you said. We need a summit for the present. We need them to come around that table and give it some of the ingredient of what a collective security could be, because that's where collective security is enshrined. It's in the Security Council. And that institution is dead as far as this collective security mission is concerned. And people are suffering from that. And don't tell me, let the Africans solve the African problems, let the Asians solve the Asian problems. This is one way of shedding responsibility on others to solve the problem. So, yes, we are facing a big challenge. And the challenge is the complete paralysis of multilateralism. The more our heads of state meet each other, because they keep meeting each other, G30, G20, G10, G-5, G7, you call it. And the more they meet, the less they agree. And the challenges are before us. And we are not really using our multilateral institutions to... So when the Secretary General calls for a summit to revive the institution, in fact, it's not revival that we need, it's resurrection. Thank you.
It's very hard to argue with that logic. If I might, I mentioned before that you were on the Overshoot Commission, and I'm interested in, I guess what I would say is one of the nice things about the Paris Peace Forum is that it has a relatively broad definition of peace and has included climate change from its origins. But the more we go on in time, of course, the linkage between sustainable peace and sustainable development, including dealing with climate change, becomes tighter and tighter. How has your work on the Commission influenced or reinforced your thinking about that connection?
So I think, currently I truly believe, I want to say that the cost of repetition, that we are really in a moment where we should not be talking about systems holding when we are putting systems to shreds through our actions, right? Because I think what we're witnessing in humanity, what we're witnessing is a humanitarian crisis which is unfolding on the TV screens. We are watching the killing, we are watching the bloodshed, we are watching children dying, and we're saying we do not want to do anything about it. And we're saying, yes, the P5 countries and the civilized world is still the civilized world. I believe we are living in the de-civilization of the world as we knew it, and we're witnessing it in real life on live television, right? So it becomes very difficult to talk about what is the Overshoot Commission going to achieve and what is not going to achieve, because it's not a moment where we are coalescing support, where we're coming together to be able to deliver on anything. And can I say that even when it comes to the work of the Overshoot Commission, because it is really looking at the climate change and saying, look, the moment has passed. We are not looking at the possibility of overshoot. We are, frankly speaking, right now on the fast train wreck, which is already going, if at the same pace we are going towards the overshoot movement. And already the wreckage is far too much. The enormity of the of the impact of climate on countries like Pakistan is huge. There were 33 million people which went through floods, which left them unattended. There were 600,000 women who were pregnant at that time, who didn't have a roof or a tent. And at the same time, I was invited to come and witness a feminist foreign policy on the sidelines of the General Assembly, where women leaders, really important countries' women leaders, continue to talk about loss and damage fund as if it was a figment of somebody's imagination or not a real thing. So what is a feminist foreign policy if it cannot change your country's position to something which is relatable, which is reflective of or sensitive to the needs of women? So I think we've bogged ourselves too deeply into our stated position. And we think that our stated position, I'll tell you what, I think we think that the world has ears, but no eyes. So we think we can keep on speaking about our positions, talk about security, talk about our commitment to peace, and keep on waging war, propagating warfare, and allowing, and show our behavior to using our veto like dozens and dozens and dozens of times to protect annexation, annihilation, even genocide. And when we use these words, we have to be careful, but really we have to stop being so careful, right? Because we have to call a spade a spade. So when the UN HCR New York office representative resigns, and he says this is a textbook case of genocide, and we still continue to talk about how multilateralism is going to work at forums such as this, I think we're kidding ourselves. I think we need to really wake up to what we've allowed humanity to degenerate to, because it doesn't matter who's being killed, that humans are being killed. What we ask is which religion, which color, which creed, which geography, and where does my country stand on that position? My country stands on continuing to use vetoes. We have to stop doing that. We have to first be humans. So really, I'm at a place where I think climate change and many other things are going to suffer because we have chosen conflict over dealing with what is a living crisis. Because this conflict, this competition that we've created with China is actually keeping us away from delivering on the global goods. And we are allowing the global goods to remain undelivered and actually learning how to fight over them also. So we are actually experiencing a moment of destabilization and seeking conflict over peace, using the language of peace to propagate war, using every human rights. We are weaponizing the human rights agenda and the development agenda because we use, when we target someone and we kill and we say, I'm the killer, it's cool because everyone's recognizing you a killer. But when you say, I'm the peace giver, I'm the one who is your refuge, I'm the one, and propagating killing, that's the dangerous moment because then there is no difference between right or wrong. And I think I'm just going to end by this. What I want to say is that, you know how Brexit happened? And a lot of people thought it wasn't the best thing to do for Britain. Most of the people who voted for Brexit were actually the older population who weren't going to suffer through or benefit from Brexit, right? What is happening in the world is exactly the same. We have old leaders who are no more in sync with the demands which are being generated from people on the streets, whether it is in the West or in the East. The General Assembly vote of 120 countries telling you that humanitarian pause is not only a requirement, but it must happen, and ceasefire is not a luxury to be bestowed, but is a requirement, shows you that the rest of the world is not with what is considered to be the elite West. And this is a very, very dangerous moment.
Thank you. Well, I think that we have definitely reached some conclusions about the failures of multilateralism particularly at the UN level, not least because of its major powers. But Mirko, I'd like to get your thoughts with respect to the role of regional organizations. I'm particularly thinking about the African Union in helping deliver on peace building and peacemaking. How did your office, or has your office, interacted with regional and sub-regional organizations on the African continent, in particular with respect to the peace process in Mozambique?
I will for sure answer that question, but let me comment also what Ghassan Salameh said. I think it is important what he said, and I think it is also the time of focus on truth and stopping these big hypocrisies that they are going around. We cannot cope anymore with that. You know, in Africa, they would like to speak, they would like to count, they would like to be at the table. So I think that building peace is not a Western business. It's not, you know, Africa needs to be listened, and I think it's the time to give them space also in the global arena and let them speak. I think in the agenda, the new agenda for peace of the Secretary General is very clear, is asking to bringing on board as much voices as possible. And in that sense also regional organizations that they are doing good work, they need to be taken on board in building peace. I think it's the time of honesty. It's just the time of honesty and truth. I think we have to go back to basic value and rebuild, of course, the United Nations on that, and stopping to just accepting vetoes all the time, but also giving floor to the one that today they start to count, and they have, and they deserve that space to speak for the world. It's the time to open up and to be honest. It's just the time to be honest.
Thank you. Thank you. We have about 4 minutes left, which is not a lot of time, but I'd like now to invite any questions from the audience on this topic. Yes. This gentleman over here in the back row.
Sorry. Thank you very much. And
could you identify yourself, please?
Sorry. My name's Ian, and I work with an organization promoting the advancement of the WPS agenda in MENA region. And so we had a very clear diagnostic. And my question is, what's next? What are some of the solutions, or what is the world of tomorrow going to look like if multilateralism doesn't work anymore?
Go ahead, Henry.
Yeah, I think that, you know, first we have to build up the trust among the major players in the world. So, for example, now the U.S. has put China as a strategic rivalry. The EU has put China as a systematic rivalry. So if we are all a rivalry, how can we work together to solve the global problem? We have a climate change just mentioned, and also this peace crisis around the world. So I think it's absolutely important, you know, all the major powers has to work together, has to really seek peace among themselves first. So I'm really glad to see the President Xi and President Biden going to meet in San Francisco. So let's hope that, you know, plus EU leaders later, we can really work out some common consensus to save the, you know, crisis of the world.
Yes, this lady back there. Thanks.
Bonjour et merci à toutes.
Good morning and thank you very much. When it comes to peace, I have an idea to promote the role of women, because women are the ones working towards peace. Because when there is a war, there's the one mourning their father, their husband, or their son. So we pay a very high price, and men, sorry for saying so, you are the one going at war all the time. So I would like to agree with Monsieur Ghassan Salameh about what he said earlier about being special envoy in Libya. He knows what was happening in the country with the military groups going everywhere and who do not promote peace in Libya. It is a major problem in the Middle East.
So obviously, UN Security Council, I believe it's Resolution 1325, has talked about the role of women in peace building from at all stages of conflict resolution, mediation, and post-conflict peace building. Do any of you have any thoughts about how that's implemented itself in the field in your experiences and its importance?
That's very politically correct, and I applaud it. That's very politically correct, and I applaud it. Now, there is another issue. The issue is the Security Council still around? We have 2 wars today, and one superpower is completely preventing the Security Council from dealing with one war, and another superpower is preventing the Council from dealing with the other war. So if the 2 major wars taking place in Ukraine and Palestine are not to be dealt with by the Security Council, what is the Security Council there for? With or without women?
Yeah, I have to say that we're going to have to wrap up here, unfortunately. But to say the least, the Security Council has taken a pounding, particularly its in this discussion, particularly its permanent members. I've done a certain amount of work on UN Security Council reform and different schemes, but one of the things that is quite clear is that in the current geopolitical environment, it doesn't matter necessarily whether you'd ever have Security Council expansion, but if the veto rules remain the same and the conflict amongst the great powers remain the same, and if the great powers do not exercise their responsibilities as permanent members the way that the Charter intends, that many of these, the hopes of the Secretary General and others about any reform will, of course, run aground. I want to thank all of you for your passionate and very honest assessments. Please join me in thanking our panel.